Everyone, thank you all very much for joining us today. We are just so extremely privileged to have General Wesley Clark with us today for our full-time MBA and MS Business special guest speaker lunch series. And as it is specifically focused in a sense on our full-time MBA and MS Business, we also did, of course, based on General Clark's background, we also did want to invite the Bush School to join us. Dr. Welsh, Dean Welsh, I believe is on, or he's invited his students, as well as the Commandant Ramirez from the Corps of Cadets as well. We wanted to invite him as well. Again, based on General Clark's background, we felt like this was a very good fit. So for all that are able to attend, it's great to have you here. I wanted, of course, to introduce General Clark. So if you've got 10 minutes, he's just got such an amazing background. Now, I'll try to keep it short, but I did want to start off, because this is a business event, I did want to start off just telling you a little bit about his business background, because many of us know him for his, just his unbelievable military career. But I did want to tell you that he is a businessman, educator, writer, and commentator. He's chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates, a strategic consulting firm. He's also chairman and founder of Envera Inc., an investment bank, chairman of Energy Security Partners, and numerous corporate boards. He's also, during his business career, General Clark has served as an advisory consultant or board member of over 90 private and publicly traded companies. He's also worked very much in the nonprofit area as well. He's a best-selling author. General Clark has written 4 books, and he's a frequent contributor on TV and newspapers. I know myself, I've seen him on major networks quite often, and recent as well. I did want to tell you about his illustrious military career, of course. General Clark retired a 4-star general after 38 years in the U.S. Army. His most recent, let's say, or his last service was for the U.S. Southern Command, and then as commander of U.S. European Command, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. He also graduated first in his class at West Point. So going back to his early days, he graduated first in his class. I mean, when I read this, General Clark, I was wowed, man. That's amazing. And while serving in Vietnam, he commanded an infantry company in combat where he was severely wounded and had to be evacuated home. Quite something. He was principal author of both the U.S. National Military Strategy as well as the Joint Vision 2010. Worked with Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who I happen to be very familiar with because of what he did, obviously, for Kosovo, where he helped write and negotiate significant portions of the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement. In his final assignment as Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, he led NATO forces to victory in Operations Allied Force, a 78-day air campaign backed by ground invasion planning and a diplomatic process, saving 1.5 million Kosovar Albanians from ethnic cleansing. Now, I can tell you firsthand, my wife is a Kosovar Albanian. I've actually got some of my family members in Kosovo listening. General Clark, I will tell you, is a hero there for what he did for Kosovo. And he's revered around the world. His awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, 5 times, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, honorary knighthoods from the British and Dutch governments, and many more awards, including numerous honorary doctorates. I have a very sort of personal thing with regards to having General Clark here, because my father himself was in the U.S. Air Force for 20 plus years. And that's how I grew up, very much an Air Force, a military brat. So I have a huge respect for General Clark, and I'm so grateful for him joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today, General Clark.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a real honor for me to be with you here and with all these wonderful people from Texas A&M. It's a little different in terms of the way you give the speech, because normally I like to look at the audience, and here I'm just looking at a blank screen, except when you're talking, Richard. So I hope you all will forgive me if maybe I don't tell a lot of jokes as in starting out. I've got a good repertoire because I used to be a joke writer for General Haig, and so I have all of his jokes, but I'm not going to use those today. What I'd like to do is talk for about 30 minutes and then take your questions and comments on this. We are at a really difficult place and a really challenging time for the United States. Everybody knows that. That's why we're all separated and doing this the way we're doing it here. But just to say a word about where I'm coming from. So I grew up in Arkansas. I went to West Point when I was 17. I turned down a couple of scholarships to go there because it was the Cold War, and I was really worried about the safety and security of the United States of America. The Soviet Union had an H-bomb. The Soviet Union was first to have intercontinental ballistic missiles and the first to launch a satellite, Sputnik. And I was an 8th grader, and it was a really frightening time for us. And so I just became someone who was really interested in national security. West Point seemed the right place. It's supposed to have the same science and technology as MIT and the same humanities as Harvard, and I thought that was pretty good. So I did 4 years at West Point. I went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. I went to Vietnam. I came home on a stretcher. And I spent the next 30 years in my Army career. And I got all over the world, and I worked with some wonderful people. And as Richard said, I got to do some extraordinary things. It was an incredible gift to be able to command American soldiers, to represent the United States in uniform. And it ended in 2000. Well, they say all good things must end, and this one ended. And I was 55 years old, and we didn't know what to do, really. And I decided to come back to Arkansas. There was a great investment bank here called Stevens that brought me in and taught me private equity and got me licensed under the Securities and Exchange Commission rules at that time. It was called the National Association of Security Dealers. Now it's called FINRA. And then 9/11 happened. I was on television virtually every day. And I knew things were going wrong in terms of the planning, because people kept talking to me and telling me, we're going to go to Iraq, we're going to go to Iraq, we're going to go to Iraq. And so I knew what the intelligence was, and I'd only been separated from that intelligence by 12, 14 months. And so I began to speak out. And when I did, I ended up, I know maybe you believe this or you don't, but I actually was drafted to run for president as a Democrat. I wasn't in a political party. I'd been in the Ford administration as an Army major, as a White House fellow. I'd worked around the White House. I'd worked in OMB and worked for Don Rumsfeld and Jack Marsh in various temporary capacities. And so I wasn't a Democrat. In fact, Democrats were kind of the enemy when we stayed in the Army after Vietnam, because Democrats kept trying to cut our budget, and they kept telling us that we weren't serving a useful purpose when we believed the U.S. was under threat. So I was always oriented the other way. But you serve whoever's the commander-in-chief regardless, and I came to respect Bill Clinton as president a lot, and the people I met in the Democratic Party, in the White House and Defense Department, State Department during that time. I had to work closely with them. And so when I saw things going wrong and I began to speak out against it, they said, well, you need to run for office. So I joined the Democratic Party. I declared my candidacy, and I had an incredible 5 months running to be president of the United States. We went to 30 states. We raised $25 million, $3 million online. And that was a lot for the 2003-2004 election cycle. I won the state of Oklahoma, had good, strong support in Texas, New York, California, DC, but in those days they weren't in the primary, so they didn't count. So John Kerry got Iowa he was from the New England. He then got New Hampshire. And then the next week, the third week, was the week of South Carolina, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and so forth. And the momentum effect, and I have to be honest, I wasn't the greatest candidate. I'm not a politician, and it's like anything in life. You have to have experience. You get better through experience. And I never even run for student council, so this was my first chance. I would go on these debates, and people would say, General, what do you say? And I would answer the question. And afterwards, the political staff that had assembled around me would say, don't answer the question. Tell them your talking points. Don't answer the question. And it was so hard for me to do. And so I know I could have been a better candidate too, but it was a great experience because I met a whole different group of people. So I went back then after that into the financial community. I worked with Goldman Sachs in their private equity as a consultant. I was chairman of a small investment bank that was publicly traded on Wall Street. I formed my own investment bank, have a consulting company. And so I'm approaching this talk and the questions you give me as someone who has seen a lot of life and high-level military, high-level politics, and high-level business. So that's my perspective. And here's what I want to talk about. First, a little bit about the background. Second, where we are today. And third, about where we need to go. So the background. When I retired in 2000, the United States was unchallengeable as the world leader. There was nobody else even close. We were the single superpower. Our army was great. Our economy was fantastic. The dot-com boom, so-called, was on, where people had first realized you could have companies that operated on the internet. People from all over the world came to study and learn our business method at Stanford Business School and Harvard. Everybody believed in the shareholder theory of value. And as my Goldman Sachs buddy told me, he said, now Wes, he said, you may not understand this. He said, but we bought this company and it's a German company. And so we're going to change this company. And the way we do it is we don't pay that much money to the CEO, but we give him shares of stock. So his interests are aligned with our interest as the shareholders of the company. And I said, oh, okay, I got that. And then he said, we're going to reorganize. I said, oh, okay, I understand. I mean, Army's always going through reorganization. You know, for years in the Army, we argued about, okay, is it 5 tanks in a platoon? Should we have 5 tanks with under a lieutenant, 4 tanks, or 3 tanks? The Israelis and the Russians had 3 tanks. The Brits had 4 tanks. The Germans had 4 tanks. We liked 5 tanks. But the 5th, anyway, that discussion is not reorganization in the business community. In the business community, that discussion of reorganization about how you fire people. So I learned private equity from the best. And what happened is that when we were struck in 2001 by Osama bin Laden, the United States responded convulsively. Yes, we had to go and strike Afghanistan because we needed to get Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban wouldn't turn him over to us. But believe it or not, when we went into Afghanistan, we didn't even have a plan to get Osama bin Laden. I mean, what kind of a leadership is that, really? And then about 2 weeks after 9/11, I was in the Pentagon. I'd only been out a little over a year, and it kind of scared me to be on TV every day and not have a public affairs officer telling me, General Clark, you got to say this and don't say that. I was just totally on my own. And I remember going in there, and I talked to Secretary Rumsfeld and Under Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, and then an officer in the Joint Staff said, General, you got to come here and see me. He said, look, we're getting ready to invade Iraq. I'm like, Iraq? Well, why do we want to invade Iraq? And he said, beats me. I guess, you know, we're not any good against terrorists, but we're really good at taking down nations. So the actual decision had been made right after 9/11. Even though it wasn't formalized in the decision process, the leadership intended to invade Iraq. And when they did so without an adequate plan as to how to get out of what they had started. And you know the consequences now. It's been 17 years. The Middle East is really a mess. And we kicked the can over. At the time, Colin Powell he said what he called the pottery barn rule. He said, it's the pottery barn rule. If you go in and you touch something and it falls off the shelf and it breaks, you have to buy it. He tried to tell President Bush, George W. Bush, he said, the pottery barn rule, you break it, you own it. Well, we went into Iraq and we broke it. And so we tried to stay and fix it, but we ended up presiding over a broken government, a civil war, and a complete terrorist campaign against us and against the Iraqi people. And this led to trillions of dollars of expenses, thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives lost, 4,000 Americans killed. We stayed in Afghanistan instead of getting out, and the situation deteriorated because we couldn't handle Pakistan. Pakistan basically needs Afghanistan in their standoff against India. And so no matter what we did in there to stand up an independent government, the Pakistanis looked at Hamid Karzai, the president at the time, as an Indian agent. As one of them told me, he said, you know who has the biggest embassy in Afghanistan? I said, well, I guess we do. He said, no, the Indians. So they were hypersensitive about this relationship. We could never get in between India and Pakistan and resolve that. So we could never really solve the Afghanistan issue. The truth is, in a military operation like that, unless you can isolate the battlefield, you can't win. And we couldn't seal the border with Pakistan and cut off support from Iran or anything of the sort. So we're there. It's been a long, hard slog. And the armed forces have done brilliantly. We've had wonderful people in there from the top to the bottom, great generals, great sergeants, great corporals and specialists from all the services. And I admire them tremendously. We've taken casualties. We didn't win, but that's not something you lay necessarily on the generals. That's really about the politics of it, what the United States wants, the mission that was given to these people. In the middle of this, things got even worse in the Middle East with when Syria fell apart and Bashar Assad's regime was attacked by civil war. In fact, various Sunni Islam groups came in and tried to support the insurgency. I remember being at the Saudi embassy in Washington in 2011 and meeting with the ambassador, and he said, General, he said, you have to tell your people, we have to get Stinger missiles in there to fight these Syrian aircraft. I said, well, why don't you tell the Pentagon that? He said, they won't listen to us. So it was the Saudis competing against the Qataris, competing against the Turks, and everybody had his own little team of fighters / terrorists in there working and being supported. We could never get the political leadership we needed that would pull those people together, make them serve an honorable purpose, and bring democracy into the region. Instead, the pot just kept getting stirred, and the Russians worked their way in on the chemical weapons issue, and suddenly Russia became re-engaged in the Middle East. This Russian operation came after Russia had intervened in Ukraine, seized the Crimea in 2014, and then launched an insurgency in eastern Ukraine to try to overthrow the Western-oriented government. The insurgency failed. It stalled out. The Russians kept the Crimea. They're under sanctions. But look, if you look back 20 years now on this, what happened? The United States became overcommitted in the Middle East without a winning strategy. And at the same time, Russia rearmed based on oil money and decided that it had to protect itself. In the late 1990s, what happened at the end of the Cold War was you had President Yeltsin in Russia. He was friendly with Bill Clinton. They were so-called drinking buddies. But underneath that, the Russian power ministries, the military, the intelligence agencies, they never changed. They were never transformed, and they never changed their view of America as the enemy. And so as Russia became strengthened with increasing oil revenues under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, they became increasingly assertive. It started in 2008 when they basically set up and won the little war with Georgia during the Summer Olympics of 2008. And then they launched the operation against Crimea, started the insurgency in Ukraine, and intervened in Syria. Russia is not a friendly power. I know they sent us a plane load of stuff, but they're not a friendly power. They don't have our best interests at heart. Their aim is to reduce America's influence in the world and reduce the influence of American values. And then you have China. So we brought China into the World Trade Association. In the 1990s, American leaders could say about China, look, yes, it's not a democratic government, and it's got some pretty tight restrictions, but, well, they're not going to be able to continue to grow economically unless they're able to transform themselves and become more democratic, because without a free flow of information, you can't have a modern, vibrant economy. Well, those were hopeful predictions, but they've been proved wrong. And in fact, China is now on the scene. As you know, it's in purchasing power parity equivalent to the United States. It's a major holder of U.S. securities, and it's a major competitor on the world scene with its Belt and Road program. And it's got the disposable funds to invest and loan all over the world, and the interest in doing so, while the United States is sort of pulling back. So that's what's happened to us. And if you look at the world right now and ask yourself, well, what's going on? What are the challenges we face? I would identify 5 challenges. First of all, there's the sort of transnational challenge, terrorism, which we haven't actually really resolved, and it's rampant in North Africa and in Southeast Asia. Along with that is a transnational challenge. You've got to wrap in pandemics. We've always known there was a danger for this. SARS in 2003 didn't get away from China very far, just to Taiwan, Korea, some Southeast Asian nations. We never got it. The MERS, which was an evolution of SARS, never came here. But we established, as a result of an anthrax scare after 9/11, the biological agency that does, called BARDA, part of the Health and Human Services Department. And so they're handling our response now. And they've been warning for a long time, and they've done the war games to show that a pandemic was coming. It was inevitable, because just like terrorism thrives when you can blow up airplanes, pandemics, because of globalization and travel and the easy movement of people all over the world and growing populations, it was an inevitable threat. So that's our first challenge. Second challenge is the challenge of cybersecurity. Of course, we're on the internet right here. How could we live without it? We couldn't be in isolation today if we didn't have the internet. And the United States, we're the nation most reliant on the internet. It's not just for social media. It's not just for communications on Zoom. It's running our industries, our transportation industry, our utility industry, all of our infrastructure, petrochemical, oil and gas. I was with a big oil and gas company a few weeks ago down in Houston, and the CEO said, I lay awake every night. He said, I've got 150 gas plants spread out across the United States, and they're all controlled by SCADA technology. In other words, data that goes through the internet that tells the plant the valves to be opened and monitors pressure and temperature and so forth. And he said, if anything goes wrong, they could blow up. He said, it's a tremendous problem. Of course, we know that you have to be conscious of identity theft. Yeah, there's money being stolen from banks, but what the United States demonstrated to the world in 2008, 2009 with Stuxnet was that you could actually cause physical destruction through the internet. We destroyed a bunch of Iran's nuclear stuff as they were trying to take and upgrade we process uranium-238 into highly enriched uranium with more U-235 in it. We destroyed their centrifuges. We made them overspin until they just torqued out and blew up. So we established this. In 2015, the Russians went a step further. They took down a large portion of Ukraine's utility grid. And so now if you go and talk to U.S. industry, they will tell you they are really afraid. In the electric utility business, if you screw up and don't comply with federal regulations, they fine you $1 million a day. And yet we don't believe, any of us, that we're totally secure in the electric power industry. We believe there's already implanted there by state actors certain, call them logic bombs, that could be activated at a time before that might cause the destruction of things like transformers, for which there's no reliable backup, and most of which have to be manufactured overseas. So cyber is a real challenge for us. Then there's the finance world. You know, in 2008, 2009, back when most of you all were, well, 10 years ago, wherever you were, maybe in grade school somewhere, then you didn't see this. I was working at Goldman Sachs as it evolved. And first, the credit markets seized up because banks didn't trust each other, for good reason, because it turned out that nobody could quite account for who owed what to whom. There were trillions of dollars out there in so-called hedges or derivatives or swaps. And this money was sometimes leveraged. And the leverage, the cross-leveraging, the sales arrangements, they were opaque. They weren't done on an open market. And as a result, it was impossible to accurately measure risk. And so, just like in financial panics in the 19th century, somebody gets the idea that, whoa, stop. This debt is no good. It's not worth what you say it is. You have to devalue. And once you mark to market, you bring the whole system down. So Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail. We went into a whole bailout program in the United States. And then we put in legislation to try to correct it. But here's what's interesting. First point is the legislation that went in to correct it was put in before we'd ever done a real study to find out what happened. And point number two is that since the legislation was put in place, the so-called Dodd-Frank legislation, that it's been loosened up considerably. So we now have 5 major banks, and they're like systemically important banks. You cannot allow them to fail. And they deal extensively with the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve pumps money into the system to maintain liquidity and to give banks the assurance that they can borrow and have all the money they need without trusting another commercial bank. And so we've emerged again as the linchpin of the world. The Federal Reserve has the authority to lend to organizations like Deutsche Bank, which is in financial trouble. So we've known that we were always on the precipice. And it turned out that even though the world was frightened and chastened after 2008, 2009, and said, we'll never do this again. We'll never let all that debt appear. We did. And the debt level in early 2020 was the highest debt level the world has ever seen. We had student loan debt, automobile debt, home mortgage debt, consumer finance debt, business debt. I mean, the world runs on debt, and debt is a confidence game. So all it takes is some trembling to shake this. And so we knew and we know today that finance is a major issue for us, and it's one of the principal challenges. China and Russia. I already talked a little about China and Russia, but basically they don't see the world the way we do. That's one of those dumb spam calls that come in. They don't see the world the way we do. What they see is a world in which American values and the American dollar dominate, a world in which the United States can willy-nilly approve sanctions on another government or on government leaders or important people like the oligarchs in Russia that are sanctioned by the Magnitsky sanctions and the sanctions we keep imposing on Russia year after year because of their illegal occupation of Ukraine. So they don't see the world as benign and good. They're not Democrats. They see democracy as a threat. Russia sees it as a direct threat because, my goodness, how could Putin stay in power if every little town in Russia got to vote on and really vote, and there was real opposition? So Putin has for 20 years managed to maintain democratic forms, but he's in charge, and it isn't a democracy. In China, there was never any pretense. It was always about the Communist Party. And when Xi Jinping came into power and even a little before that, it was clear that China was moving to attain its great power status. Just to give you an idea on this, in 2005, when I was in China, the head of the China Communist Youth Organization, who spent a year at the Kennedy Center, told me this. He said, China is a great power now, and it will never be picked on as it has been by its neighbors for the last 2 centuries. He said, but we know you Americans were best friends with Britain, and Britain gave you leadership of the world. China wants to be best friends with America, so you will give us leadership of the world. Now, this was the China 2005 version of the China dream. When Xi Jinping came in and when he watched the American response to the financial crisis in 2008, and then looked at the Obama administration as it worked its way forward, he became increasingly confident and sure that he didn't have to wait that much longer for China to take over leadership of the world, and that didn't have to be given, it could be taken. He made a couple of missteps. He thought the renminbi could be convertible currency before it was. He's pushed in the South China Sea and gotten a little bit of opposition, but he hasn't backed off. He's got now 2 aircraft carriers, a 3rd under construction, and he will have regional air superiority in the South China Sea area. And as though we would contest that by force, we wouldn't. But China's influence is heavy-handed in that region. When the Chinese ambassador comes in and talks to you, as one Philippine diplomat explained to me, he said, they don't say please. They don't say, may I suggest. They tell you China wants this, and we expect you to do this. So they're a tough competitor for the United States out there, and they don't support our values. They don't support the way we do business. They don't support our freedoms. And so a world dominated by China and Russia will be a world in which Americans won't have the same opportunities for freedom, for democracy, for living under the rule of law that we have enjoyed for the last century. Finally, there's climate change. And everybody's looking at the pandemic right now, but the truth is we're moving into the warmest spring we've ever had. And in Arkansas, we're 50% above our annual rainfall average for the last 2 years. Each year we're above it. So the climate's definitely changing. From the time I grew up here in the 50s to today, spring comes 2 weeks earlier, fall comes 2 weeks later, and we know that's the pattern across this latitude. In places like Africa, the rain doesn't fall. The drought line from the Sahara has moved hundreds of miles south into what was previously grassland and grazing opportunities. It's forced tribes and peoples to migrate. That causes conflict. And that destabilizes governments. And so these people don't have the resources to fight back. We know climate change is hitting all over the world. Maybe Vladimir Putin once joked that he would like it because it would warm up the Soviet or Russian Arctic. And it's true that there are ships now that have the Northwest Passage, and Russia has claimed the North Pole as its own, I guess. But the truth is that it's going to be bad for everybody. And it's a national security level crisis. It's changing agriculture, changing economies, 2/3 of mankind possibly in danger with rising sea levels, new diseases, on and on and on. So it's coming. We said 15 years ago that you had to keep the carbon dioxide atmosphere in the atmosphere below 450 parts per million. And it's going up at about 4 parts per million per year. And it's around 410, 412 last measurements. So we don't have 30 years to get the problem under control. If we stopped everything right now, the carbon buildup in the atmosphere would still cause glaciers to melt. The Greenland ice cap would be melting, and Antarctica would be. So we're already too late to stop the rising sea levels. It's a question of how far it goes and how rapidly. So those are the big challenges that you face. I'll be long gone from the scene, and you'll be dealing with all of these challenges. So how do we do this? So let me just sketch out a couple of ideas, and then I'm going to stop and ask for questions. So on terrorism, we have to give people meaning in their lives. People don't become terrorists just because they're poor. They don't become terrorists just because Big Brother isn't watching them. They become terrorists because they can't find a way to find meaning in their lives. And the West hasn't really faced up to this challenge, but each of you in your own life has to go through this journey. What is my life about? What am I going to do that's significant? Is it about making a living? Is it about having a family? Is it about seeing my kids go through school? Is it about their marriage and being a grandparent? What is it that gives significance? Thousands of young people all over the world decided it was about killing other people in the name of their God. And that's, in a world that's as interconnected as this, that's terrible. Pandemics, look, we know what to do about pandemics, but we got to resource it. This one caught us short. This was a warning. We did not take seriously the pandemic threat. This administration took it less seriously than the last administration, but nobody's really organized, stocked, prepared, kept the manufacturing available to deal with the conflict or the problem. And so this is a real learning experience. But thus far, we think we can handle coronavirus. If the mortality rate from coronavirus wasn't 4%, if it was like 50%, that would be another matter. So this was a warning, a wake-up call. On cyber, we just need better training on cyber. There's hardware, there's software, but anything that can be done with bits and bytes can be undone. So we're in a new era here, and it's going to require your attention. On finance, I hope you all in the business side will move past the shareholder theory of value. We need a stakeholder theory of value. Businesses have a responsibility to their community, to their workers, as well as to the owners and to the country that they serve. During the Cold War, it was great. American businesses went abroad. They took American values. We thought that was the right antidote to communist ideology. But today, so many big American businesses have no loyalty to the United States. They're not even really American. They take their money abroad. They don't pay taxes. They don't support U.S. priorities. They would look at this as violation of their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So we need a new generation of business leaders who can come in and keep it all in perspective. Those businesses exist and thrive because of American values, supported ultimately by the strength and will and resolve of the United States of America and its armed forces. If they're not strong, if that resolve isn't there, if we don't hold this country together, those businesses will be consumed in a wave of corruption and takeovers, just as happened in places like Russia. So we have to work the finance piece. China and Russia, look, we're in a hybrid war with Russia, and we don't want it, but they do. They want NATO disassembled. They want the European Union taken apart. And Russia is in a race against China. Whoever gets to Europe first and can control it, they control the world as far as the way these countries see it. So China is busy making its inroads in places like Italy and Hungary with state backing, state loans, a railroad that was constructed that runs from Spain all the way back into Beijing. But Russia's out there with its populist movements, with its various forms of activities aimed at undercutting European sentiment and building up nationalist right-wing governments that ultimately will be victimized by Moscow. So we've got to be engaged. We've got to put our allies front and center. We've got to work with them on a collegial basis. In 1890, the Russian Foreign Minister, Count Gorchakov, quoting 1832, the British Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston, said, "Russia has no permanent friends, only permanent interests." When I was NATO commander, I had heard Yevgeny Primikov, then the Russian foreign minister, quote Count Gorchakov from 100 years earlier. Nothing could be more wrong. You know, in our interconnected world, We have to work together. We have to have permanent friends. We can't have a world where nations compete against each other on the basis of obsolescent national interest. We're too connected. And that brings me to climate change. If we don't work together with others, we'll never solve this problem, because government can't do it alone and no country can do it alone. So we need leadership that will pull this country together. And we know what we have to do about climate change. We've got the technology, we've got the money, we've got the resources. We just need to do it. So with that, I'd like to stop. And Richard, can we have some questions?
Thank you very much, General Clark, for just an amazing talk. Sorry, I've got some emergency services down the street here, so don't mind the sirens. Yeah, this is a great time. I see Ryan's got a question for you. Ryan is one of our full-time MBA students.
Thanks, Richard. So first of all, General Clark, thank you very much for the really engaging and comprehensive discussion. My question involves, in this incredibly complex and morally ambiguous time, how have you found in your experience to best stay focused and uphold your own moral values and those American values that you and we all hold so dear in this world, when it seems like, you know, everyone's constantly changing and there's so much pressure to change our own values? How do you stay true to your own moral barometer?
Well, it's a really important question, and it goes into business ethics, as you're going to find, and then into your personal life. So I think it starts with, you know, who you are in your core. Some of us identify ourselves as Christians, but there are a lot of great people in the world who don't consider themselves Christians. They're not Christians. They have other faiths. Some just meditate. But I think you have to find what your own core values are. And then I think you have to go back to those and refresh those and think about those for year after year after year. The question is, when you're a young person and you're 17 years old, 18 years old in high school, and you say, what can I do? What will I do with my life? Don't you want to end up at the age of 77 or 87 or 97 saying, I was true to what I thought was the correct values. I learned some hard lessons, but I've lived my values. You just have to do it. Look, the world is full of temptations. And when you're in the business community, greed is an amazing motivator. We've all seen Gordon Gekko on Wall Street. And if we don't know him personally, we've seen him in a lot of other guises. And so there are things more important than money. In my little investment bank, the guy who was the CEO came to me at one point. He says, hey, look, we're supposed to raise some money for Larry Flynn and Hustler. What do you think about that? I said, I think it's a really bad idea. I said, you've got 3 daughters. You want to go home and tell your 9 and 11-year-old daughters you're raising money for a pornographic magazine? He said, no, I guess not. But you see, this is the kind of temptation in a small scale that's all over. It's like this business community right now. It's full of profiteering with people trying to sell these N95 masks. And the N95 mask is probably worth 60 cents. So if you want a real, genuine N95 mask, you might be now paying $15 for it. And a surgeon wears it in an emergency room and throws it away after one use. And the guy who's selling it may be making, you know, the Patriots aircraft just brought 1 billion masks in from China. I mean, it's what happened in the Civil War with wartime profiteering on uniforms. It happens. And so be true to your own values. You know what's right and wrong in your heart. Live by those values. All of us are here courtesy of somebody else. We've all gotten to where we are because other people believed in us. We've all gotten here because we had support. We've all gotten here because people thought we were honest and trustworthy. We have to live up to that.
Thank you very much.
I have one question from Wes James Thompson. He's one of our veterans that recently graduated from the full-time MBA program. If we can reasonably expect things to continue to devolve internationally, what do you think the effect will be on the financial industry? You mentioned that debt is a confidence game. if perspective is reality, will there be a shift in what the standard is in regard to perspective?
Well, of course. And, but the dollar is very, very heavily entrenched. Right now, we got into a dollar economy in the 1970s as a result of being an oil importing nation. And we paid for that with dollars. And we created billions of dollars of floating around called, at the time we called them euro dollars. And they were in the European market. And so these dollars became the means of world trade. Still, something like 90% of world trade is denominated in dollars. So if you're going to denominate it in something else, you have to have an alternative. Gold, okay, it's not going to be gold. Gold, there's not enough of it. It's not, it's just, people understand that if you've limited your economy to gold, you're chaining yourself down to something that's obsolete. Well, what is it? It's not the renminbi yet, because people don't, in the financial community, don't really trust China. You want to look at non-performing loans, look at China, but of course they have the Communist Party behind it. So it's like a shadow government behind the government. At any point, the Communist Party can go to any bank and say, write off all those bad loans. They never existed. And by the way, change your books and take it all away. And there's no transparency in any of this. So it won't be China. It's not the British pound. Then what is it? A basket of currencies, the euro? Well, it's not the euro, because the euro doesn't really have a central bank that can function as a true central bank. So there really isn't an alternative right now, but nations are seeking an alternative. So China buys Saudi oil and pays for with renminbi. And we're in a sanctions regime right now. We're using the US dollar to sanction governments. And most central banks can't operate without the permission of the US Treasury. They can't exchange and work with other countries. And then their commercial banks have to work with the central banks. So if you were looking at it from Russia and China's perspective, you wouldn't look at just the military. You'd say, my God, the US through the dollar dominates the whole world. And yet, like we say, it's a confidence game. So the dollar is as strong as the United States is strong, and as strong as the United States government is strong. So I don't want to, go into politics unless you ask me. But if I were the president of the United States, I wouldn't be trying to anger all my European allies. You need them. Europe's got a huge economy, almost as large as our own, and we need to work with them. They're the group that most closely share American values in the world. They're the ones that we could most rely on, as opposed to China or Russia or Saudi Arabia or some other country. So we need our allies in this. And if we have our allies and we're working with Europe, then the American dollar will stay strong, because the American economy will stay strong, because the American economy is based on confidence in the American government and our worldwide network, security network, ultimately.
Okay. Hold on one second. So I've got now Preston Wallace would like to ask you a question. He's one of our current veterans.
Hi, Preston.
Good afternoon, General Clark. Thank you again for your time today. Like Richard said, I'm a veteran as well, and I did spend time all over the South Pacific, in the Philippines, in Japan, in the Marianas Islands, as well as some time in the Middle East. This question I have is an objective question about how you would justify or explain the difference. Whereas we position ourselves as a nation militarily all over the world, in very close proximity to these other countries. However, in the 60s, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was a very much red line for us. And then on the other side of that coin, China is saying that it is a red line for us to be in the South Pacific. How do you explain that dichotomy?
Well, I think, you can't exactly use moral relativism in looking at international security policy. I mean, you have to believe in what you believe in, and then it sort of comes out one way or the other in the struggle and tussle between nations and systems. So China has never respected Western law. We used Western law to dismember China in the 19th century. And we kept it isolated during the time of the Communist Revolution and into Deng Xiaoping's period in the 1970s. So when you take China to court in the international court and say, you can't occupy these reefs in the South China Sea, I mean, they don't belong to you, that belongs to the Philippines. And the court says, it belongs to the Philippines. China says, we're not interested in Western law. We're interested in our own security. Yes, okay, so if you want to follow the Chinese system and say, yes, they should have a right to be interested in this, remember, you're dealing with a country where the courts and the court system is a facade. The country is run by the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, I mean, they're not necessarily all evil. They're just a lot of good people trying to, you know, in a system in which there's absolute power vested in the top, in which there's secret police and secret arrests and secret interrogations that never see the light of day. It's a system maybe like the U.S. Army, if the U.S. Army was put in charge of the country with a bunch of people who are graded and given efficiency reports as they move up through the ranks and promoted if they're successful. But at the top, there's control. And because of that control, there's insecurity. Now, China probably shouldn't have a democratic government right now. I say that because you can't have, I mean, look how hard democracy is for the United States, and we've had 200 years at it. You throw it on China, you might have chaos again, and maybe you'd have warlords emerging. You don't know. So I wouldn't put that on China right now. But if the Philippines want democracy, if Indonesia wants democracy, if Malaysia wants democracy, if Vietnam wants, no, they're still under the Communist Party. But if these countries are seeking democratic forms of government, then they need enough freedom of action and freedom from pressure to pursue that. It's in our interest as Americans to deal with democratic governments. Why? Because when there are disputes, they can be resolved through courts. And the courts are, look, there's no pure institution as far as human affairs are concerned. Everything is always influenced by other factors. But relatively speaking, the United States court system and international court systems and court systems in most of these countries are much more transparent and much less amenable to influence than, let's say, the Chinese or the Russian court system. And so when you're talking about American business, you're talking about American interests, you're talking about American freedoms, you're talking about trying to preserve and protect American influence in the world. And it's not a relative thing. It's not like you say, okay, you can have, you know, I see it your way, you should see it my way, and let's do a compromise. There's not a compromise here in that sense. What has to happen is we have to be strong enough and resilient enough to help China come to terms with a different set of values without feeling paranoid and insecure. If China wants to keep its values and be under the Communist Party domination, that's China's problem. But that shouldn't be imposed from without on other countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, etc. That's the basis for it. That's the way I would explain it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your service.
Okay, I had seen that Dr. Arvind Mahajan had a question. Arvind is the, yes, he still does. Arvind is the Associate Dean for the Graduate Programs Office and Professor of Finance.
Thank you, General Clark, for your insights and wisdom. You mentioned the lack of American or void of American leadership on a variety of arenas around the world. And oftentimes, leadership emerges from times of crises. And most of the leaders in the United States, even though they have come from sports, they have come from business, but they typically have come from politics, in particular military leaders who became politicians, to lead the country in crises. In your view, when you look at the landscape of American politics, are you as optimistic that this is a fertile arena from which great statesmen can emerge, especially in the context of the current crises, which could be existential in its nature? And if the picture is not very pessimistic, do you think the role of money in deterring potential leaders from coming to the surface is one reason for that?
Well, that's a really great question. And first, it's really great to meet you, and thanks for being there at Texas A&M. I'm sure you have a lot to share with the students there.
Thank you,
sir. Look at it this way. The United States is so important in the world that other nations can't trust the American people to elect their own president. Think about that. It's been that way for a long time, starting really with, even with George Washington. He warned about foreign influence on the elections. And so there's always been a fear, and there's always been an inclination, and people have always tried to influence American politics from abroad. I think it's easier now, given social media and the money that's in politics. And I'd like to see us get the money out of politics. But then who actually becomes a leader? Well, it was generals early on because they had the reputation. Businessmen were always assumed to be crooked. Nothing against now the MBA students at Texas A&M, okay? But everybody knew that, you know, deals were cut in dark corners, and that's how people made money in trade and other things. And so, and we've seen the same pattern as money came out of Eastern Europe in the last 30 years. Money starts illegally, it gets washed through charities and art and various things. Suddenly families become respectable when the origins weren't so respectable. So in the early days of this republic, it was George Washington, it was Andrew Jackson, it was Ulysses Grant, it was William Henry Harrison. They were all men who had military service because their military exploits captured public imagination. Grant didn't do so well as a president, but Theodore Roosevelt came in, and he knew what he was after. He got the notoriety. He rode up on a horse in battle in Cuba, and with his Rough Riders, became the vice president, and then became the president when McKinley was shot. And then Eisenhower was so popular because of the success of World War II that he had the national notoriety. Nobody's had it since. And maybe they shouldn't. You know, government is a very complex thing. And the reason America has been successful has not just been the character of the president, but it's been the professional civil servants and the people who have been dedicated around the president. Money's always had an outsized role in American democracy. We're only relatively better than other countries. You know, if you look at the Constitution and really look at it, you ask, okay, well, in the history class, you always tell you there was this big struggle between the North and the South, between the shipping and merchants in the North and the farmers in the South. Yeah, you could say it that way. But if you were an African American, you might say it another way. You might say it was a struggle between those who owned slaves and wanted to protect the slave holding system from those who wanted free men and free capital to build America. So there are many ways of interpreting how this country evolved. It's always been about money. Politics is the way that influence and is developed. It's the way that interests are served. And what distinguishes democracy from other systems is, first, that insofar as possible, we make these trade-offs transparent. So we have to register if we're lobbyists. We have to publish the lists of donations to political parties. Now, some of that dark money crept in through the Supreme Court in 2010, but you're never going to eliminate the influence of wealth, because that's what all societies are about. Wealth is security. Wealth is being able to take care of your family, to be assured that you can sleep at night, to be sure that, if you're on the frontier, that you could afford gunpowder for your musket. But wealth today is about having the diversification of assets so that if something happens like this downturn, you're not wiped out, that you're not out there unemployed. And people work all their lives for that. And you can't say in this system it's illegitimate. Could we build a better system? Well, you'd have to evolve it. For the first time in mankind's existence, there's enough wealth in the world today that every human being could have a home, could have clothing, could have food on the table, could be treated for disease. But the wealth isn't equitably distributed. If you tried to equitably distribute it, you'd have a lot of resistance, obviously, but also you'd be undercutting people's motivations for working. People that make a lot of money, a lot of them wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning worried about how am I going to make that next dollar. They use it as scorekeeping, but it is motivating. So you have to be able to transition gradually to a system in which people are more intrinsically motivated, in which people are doing good because they want to do good, not because they're afraid of failure, of bankruptcy, and ultimately of starvation and impoverishment. Can we do that? I don't know. I mean, that's the real challenge for this generation of leaders. Can you go beyond greed is good into something larger? And can your political system reflect that? I'm encouraged because I see business schools now not taking so much interest in shareholder theory of value and talking more about stakeholder theory of value. I'm encouraged because I see the outcry on the left wing of the Democratic Party that says there's energy in terms of moving the needle, moving the country slightly in the direction of greater recognition of social responsibilities and collective responsibilities rather than just private good. But America's always alternated in cycles. And this period of, let's call it the Reagan era from 1980 to 2020, it's brought tremendous advancement, tremendous technology development, tremendous change to the country. But now maybe we need a period of consolidation. Who's the best person to lead it? Will it be a general? Will it be a businessman? Will it be a real estate developer? Will it be a famous celebrity from movies? We don't know. But whoever leads has to respect the competence of the people who serve in the federal civil service and in the military. They have to listen to their advice, but they have to apply their own judgment to it. And they have to show the competence and skill and personal professionalism to be elected to that high office. And there's no guarantee, I would say, that democracy will survive. You know that. And you're from the Middle East, so you know how difficult this challenge is. There's no guarantees in this. It's just up to each and every one of us to work to make it happen. We should try to reduce the role of money in politics, at least in the direct election. And in the dark pack, we should make it transparent. We should encourage freedom of the press. We should try to protect the press from pressures from government. We should encourage the best people to get into government. We should try to encourage people to be motivated by public service, not just private wealth. And if we can do all these things, we can keep it in balance and move in the right direction. And I'm still an optimist and a believer in this country. We're not perfect, but we're the best there's been so far, in my view.
Thank you. Festus has a question.
Good afternoon, General. I just got admitted to Texas A&M for the full-time MBA, so I'm happy to share that with everyone. And I have a quick question in regards to U.S. Hegemony being a world superpower. Empires rise and fall, that's a fact. And based off of current trends, it looks like China would overtake the U.S. as a world superpower in the near future. how should the United States react to Latin American countries, Mexico, traditional countries that, do what the US wants them to do to seek greater ties to China? How should the US react to these countries seeking greater ties to China? Just like how South Korea, Japan have ties to the US, how should the US, react to Latin America seeking greater ties to China?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, China's there. When I was the commander in Panama and looking over Latin America, the Chinese began to come in and displace Taiwan. Taiwan had been there, and Taiwan gave grants to these Central American countries so that after China was recognized, they wouldn't de-recognize Taiwan. And gradually, China has displaced every one of them through its influence and through its money. And so this is a long-term trend. But look, here's the thing. We all have to roll in this world together. The world's big enough for both China and the United States. I've seen great American business leaders and Canadian business leaders and Mexican business leaders doing the right things with their businesses, helping the people, helping communities, and helping lift people up from poverty and ignorance to provide them education. And if China could do that better than the United States, everyone would love China and it would be better for the people. I think you have to accept that in the course of human events, it's not about what flag you're wearing, but it's about what you're doing for other people. And by and large, there's never been a country that's been as benevolent as the United States when it's had great influence. Is it always benevolent? No. Is every American businessman selfless and willing to give to charity? No. I'll give you an example of that. I mean, I was working with the Prime Minister of Romania, and he had leased his oil fracking to Chevron. And so they paid him $30 million. They got control of this huge tract of land, and he was looking for economic development. He said, General Clark, Chevron came in here, they paid $30 million, we took the money, but they're not doing anything with this land. Why aren't they developing the oil on it? So I said, I don't know, I'll ask Chevron. So I called I got somebody on the board of directors. I called various levels. I finally got 4 levels down in Chevron. Finally, there was some Chevron middle manager who was responsible for Eastern Europe. And he came in and he told the Prime Minister of Romania, he says, look, it's true. We paid you $30 million. Now we got it, okay? But it's not in our program to develop it this year. We'll develop it when it damn well suits our program. And okay, I mean, he didn't make any friends for Chevron and he didn't make any friends for America. And, it's people make mistakes. And so, we're all human. And, but on balance, I think what we have to expect is China is going to come in. They've got disposable income. They've got a lot of smart Chinese businessmen. If they come in there and it lifts up people's welfare, that's fine. We should be welcoming that in the United States and say these people are better off in Central America and Latin America than they've ever been before. That's a good thing. Now, if they come in and say, okay, and we're going to sell you weapons and we're going to tell you the Americans are bad and we want all business to go to Chinese and no competition and no contracting except what we tell you to do, well, then that's bad. And then that's where the United States government has to have enough influence and power to not let that happen. So, but on a person-to-person basis is where it all starts. So when you've got your MBA and you're out there, remember your success is not just how much money you make or how big the company is that you built. It's what you're doing for other people. The best businessmen and the ones who've done the best that I've met from all over the world are the ones who care the most about others.
That's really great advice, General Clark. Couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's very much the Aggie spirit as well. So thanks for sharing that. I know Mark Falkenberry had a question. Mark, is your hand?
Yeah, I'm here. So okay, General Clark, I'm Mark Falkenberry. I'm on our MBA advisory board. I'm Vice President of Finance at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And first off, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you for your amazing leadership and service to our country. Question I have for you is around this shift from shareholder value to stakeholder value. A lot of companies, particularly in my industry, in the tech industry, are trying to do that very ineffectively at this point. But do you have an example of a company, a US company, who you think has made that shift effectively and how they did it?
I'm not going to give you that example because I can't get into the details of companies that I work with enough to explain it. But I will tell you this, that just like when we went to shareholder theory of value, these changes take a while. They're not easy because you're dealing with investors, you're dealing with analysts, and you're dealing with market vicissitudes and company leadership. So all of that's in the pot together. And of course, you've got competition. So if you're a company that keeps your employee pay as low as possible, then what you would expect to see is less loyalty to the firm. In an environment in which there's a shortage of labor, a shortage of positions, then people hang on to those jobs even if they don't like them. At a time in which there's a shortage of labor, employee loyalty becomes much more important. And it becomes a matter of having the best motivation, getting the best out of each of your employees. And that's the challenge that in the tech industry, people have to face. The tech industry has sort of skated on thin ice for a while because starting really in the dot-com era, when young people could come out and make millions of dollars overnight by starting such and such .com, people had the idea that in that industry, I just got to get out there and work. And the people who were like 5 years ahead from Harvard MBA, they were like, yeah, you want to work here? Okay, it's $30,000 a year, but I'll give you 2% of the stock in the company if you work here, and it's vested after 4 years, you know. And so they would take it for the experience and so forth. So there's a tremendous amount of turbulence. If you look at, for example, the tech scene in New York City, there's people there changing jobs every 6 to 8 months. Now, all this is before the pandemic. And a lot of them give up on it. So there are companies that should succeed that probably don't succeed because of this. But it's concealed in the money that's poured in. This is a broad social change. And if it doesn't get expressed properly and picked up by the business community, it will be expressed in the political community. And this is where AOC gets her energy in Queens, because of the ferment in that tech industry at the bottom end of New York City. When you take highly educated people who are articulate and you put them in job after job and exploit them, pretty soon they get fed up and they see where they are. So young people in their 20s who have listened to the siren call of high tech and have been motivated to get into this industry, learn software, make money, build your own company. A lot of them, maybe they didn't have the talent originally, but they had the education and they had enough communicating skills to make it to that point. They're unhappy. So they will force a change on companies. Now, one of the companies I work with is a recruiting company. And so it works for companies like Hewlett Packard, and it brings in your labor, and it grades companies based on how well they take care of their workforce. It's not just about having foosball and breaks and snacks at the break room. Maybe that's part of it, but it's about what the career path is in the company. It's also what the company stands for, and young people are increasingly discriminating on this. So I think these are the kinds of pressures that cause change, as well as, you know, what you're educated and what people tell you to do. You feel it in the labor market, don't you?
Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry, for sure. No, definitely. And I think it's definitely the the younger employees that are driving the move. I think the one thing though that we see is in industry, particularly in the tech industry, you see a lot of marketing towards stakeholder value without real change. And so, yeah.
Of course. I mean, but that's the way it always starts. It starts with the marketing, and then people say, well, you're not living up to your values.
Yeah.
And then the pressure comes down. But, you know, everything in a way is about marketing. One of my friends is a big investment banker in Denmark. And he says, oh, I make like 300,000 a year, and I run the pension fund, the largest pension fund in Denmark. And we pay 60% upfront in taxes, and then nobody makes much money in Denmark. Well, that's not actually true, because there are a lot of wealthy Danes who own companies and have got family money and a lot of things. But okay, but he seems content with that. In the United States, we disguise it a little bit, because what we have is we have federal taxes, state taxes, property taxes, county taxes, and sales taxes. And so it's true, we don't have a VAT, but we've got lots of taxes. We market ourselves as low tax, but in fact, we're not that much lower than anybody else. And so there's marketing everywhere in this. And companies that say they're going to work stakeholder theory of value, they will eventually be held to that standard. I'm glad they're saying it. That's the right way to begin the change.
Sure. For sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Great question. So we have Ben Adams, one of our current full-time MBA students, has a question for you, General Clark.
Sure.
Howdy, General Clark. So leaders, to be effective, have to have a diverse set of experiences and perspectives, and that can't possibly be obtained without reading. And so I'd be curious to hear your insight, into maybe some books that have impacted you and your career and that you might recommend to us. But then maybe a little bit deeper than that, your approach to reading from a diverse perspective.
I agree. I mean, you have to, the whole idea in life is to learn from other people's experiences rather than go through it on your own. There's this old saying, it says, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. You learn a lot of bad, tough things. When I got out of the military and I was interviewing at Goldman Sachs, I told John Thane, who was the #2 guy at Goldman at the time, I said, I want to learn business the same way I know the military. I can go in a military unit, I can look at them and immediately size them up. He says, I know business that way. He said, I see 25 businesses a day coming across my desk. You come here and you'll see that. So I didn't join that Goldman Sachs at that point, but I have been with a lot of businesses, and I've been with businesses that have failed. I've been with businesses where the executives tried to cheat on revenue recognition. I've been with businesses that got over-levered. I've been with businesses that made extravagant promises to employees they couldn't keep up with. I've been with businesses where CEOs lost attention and focus and lost their business. I've seen all of that in this. I've also been with probably 2 or 3 of the greatest LBOs ever done. So I've seen it and seen those companies in great detail. The best leaders are the ones who have attention to detail. They know the technology or whatever it is. They understand it. They're not just financial wizards. It's not just about manipulating Excel spreadsheets. It's not about just asking, hey, did you securitize your accounts receivable? Why, we've got a firm that can take those accounts receivable and, get rid of them right now. They'll collect it and you'll get 80%, blah, blah, blah. It's not about knowing tricks. It's about really understanding your business and then dealing with people in an honest, straightforward way. And then having a broad outlook and a broad perspective. So that brings me to the reading. So yes, you have to read lots and widely. I mean, I hope, you've got a basic background in literature and English literature, let's say. You've read some poetry. Maybe you haven't been back to Shakespeare recently, but it's there and you know how to get it if you're interested and you want to do it. But you need history. You need to read economic history. You need to read the experiences of people who went through the Depression. One of the things that One of my friends who was one of the big analysts at Lehman Brothers in the 1980s told me the other day, he says, these people on Wall Street, they're all 26-year-old MBAs doing these analysts. They don't even understand business. He said, when I came into Lehman Brothers, I was schooled by people who'd been in business for 30 years before they let me write stuff out there. And they weren't MBAs. They were people who understood life. And okay, so maybe the Excel spreadsheet's been overdone a little bit. Still got to know how to read it, how to work with it. But for me, I read history. I've really tried to read biographies, try to read and learn other people's perspectives, not only American perspectives, but perspectives of other nations. And when I go abroad and I travel and I do business all over the world, I always try to get something personal back from people. What's your life like? What are you thinking about? What's your family? Where are your children? What are their interests? What do you read? And what about literature? You find some amazing things. For example, if you're at Texas A&M and most of you believe that, you know, in World War II, the Americans won and we fought the Japanese and the Germans. If you go to UCLA, and I taught a class at UCLA a few years ago on national security, I said, now, I explained, I said, when I grew up in Arkansas, I was born in Chicago. I was the only person in my high school class or in my grade school class all the way through who wasn't born and raised totally in Little Rock, Arkansas. We were all from Little Rock. I said, how many of you here at UCLA were born from out, you know, grew up or were born outside the United States? And I expected maybe of the 30, half a dozen would raise their hand. All but 3. So that means this was like 2017. So these people were in their early 20s. So they were born at the time the Cold War ended. Their parents weren't Americans. They have no knowledge of World War II, much less the Civil War. Vietnam, which was such a big influence on your parents or your grandparents, if you're an American, that was insignificant to them unless they came from Vietnam. And if they came out of Vietnam, they probably love Americans. And because, you know, we built a lot of friendships in Vietnam despite what happened there. And so just have to really engage with other people and have a broad outlook in life. At the same time, you've got to build the professionalism in what you're doing. I never see successful CEOs who are just financiers, unless they're in banks. I mean, everybody else, it's about, you know, if they're in a software company, they can actually write software. If they're doing national security work and building a company that does radars, they actually understand radars. They're not just people who came up and said, hey, you know what? You've got 2 secretaries for every 4 executives. I think you need to have only 1 secretary for every 4 executives. Let's fire 8 secretaries in your section. And then we'll do this across the company. And for every $1 we save in income, we'll raise our market cap by $6. How about that? And so that's like a financial engineering trick. I learned that when I worked, but that's not what makes a company great. What makes a company great, what makes somebody able to do a great job in business or in his community is much broader focus on broader understanding of life and then the ability to get to the heart of what the business does. Helpful?
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Excellent. We've got another question. We've got probably time for 2 more questions. We got another question. Cullen Brungs has a question for you, General Clark.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your time today and your service. I was wondering, since 1979, Iran's kind of had its own approach in the Middle East. Do you foresee the current sanctions working, or is it going to take something else to dissuade Iran from some of the policies it pursues?
I don't see the current sanctions working. And I don't know what the answer is on this. Honestly, I mean, I think Iran is still a revolutionary state. I think it's still trying to establish its own hegemony. I think it excites a lot of fear among other states in the region, particularly in Saudi Arabia. It's really since 1979 and the action at the mosque there. that really turned the Saudis against the Iranians and showed them they couldn't be trusted. But I don't have a better policy. I would simply say it's one of those problems that's not easily fixable. The Iranian people themselves have to fix this. Now, often I've had several Iranians come up to me in airports. They say, "Oh, General Clark, what are we going to do? Are we going to get rid of those people in Iran?" I said, "Well, I mean, it's really up to the Iranians." I said, "Do you want to go back there and help them?" I said, "Well, no, I'm a dentist, and no, I don't want to do that." I said, "Well, do you want your children to sign up and fight for the Shah's son and go in there and form a revolution?" "Well, no, they're in college." And so, okay, they're happy Iranian Americans, and they're happy where they are. I feel sorry for the people in Iran. I know they're being whipsawed, but I also know that, people are amazingly adaptable. And inside Iran, despite all the hardship and everything else, there's people falling in love and getting married and raising families and proud of what their children are doing in school and playing sports and doing the best they can. And hopefully at some point, as the generation that brought us the Iranian Revolution ages out, younger people will find a way to work Iran back in. And we'll do it without a war, and we'll do it without revolution in the Middle East inspired by Iran. For me personally, I can't understand why the Iranians, keep wanting to say death to Israel. But it seems to work in Iranian politics. It seems to be like the badge of allegiance. Yes, I believe in death to Israel. Okay, well, as long as you believe, yes, I'm against the great Satan. Okay, well, all right. As long as that's your expression, then don't expect the great Satan in Israel to come beckoning you in when you're wishing for their destruction. So I think it's got to be two ways. But as I saw about Saddam Hussein in 2001, 2002, yes, he was a bad guy, but we didn't have to invade. It wasn't a necessary war. It was a war we chose to start for other reasons. He could have been contained through the existing set of sanctions. He was much less a threat than the Iranian threat that we released in the region. And anybody who understood it understood that once you got rid of Saddam Hussein, you lost the buffer that kept Iran bottled up in the region. And so the Iranians really prospered by that geostrategic mistake from the United States. I think, it is what it is. You have to live with it as it is. We'll do a lot better if we focus on an infrastructure program at home, our own education system, trying to invest in real assets in the United States rather than just hotels and gambling casinos, and putting new technology in place. There's a whole revolution in technology that's out there that can't quite break through because of the oil industry and the utility industry. There's batteries, there's solar cells, there's wind power, there's all kinds of things that are waiting if they can get the kind of infant industries break. The tech revolution came about because of government investment in the defense sector. And with the new challenge of China and Russia and the investment in high energy, directed energy weapons and hypersonic vehicles and space again, maybe we'll have another renaissance of technology in the United States. That seems to be the best driver of technology. The internet, transistor, everything came out of the Defense Department investments one way or another. We'll probably have another wave if we stop buying bombs and bullets for the Middle East and start investing in our own technologies here at home.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Well, General Clark, you've been so gracious to give us an hour and a half of your time. I know it's just a minute or two before 2:30. I wanted to give you, kind of like an opportunity maybe for some closing comments. We're so happy that you joined us today.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. It was a real honor to be here. Look, what I would say in closing is this: to you students, you're in a privileged place in humanity. You're students in the early days of the 21st century. You're in a country that has virtually unlimited opportunity for you. if you take a broad view, if you work diligently, if you aim to do good for others at the same time you're doing well for yourself, you'll make this country even better for yourself, your families. You'll have a great experience in mankind. And you just have to try to work things out. I learned one of my most important lessons I learned in my late 40s and early 50s was working for General Kashvili, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And every day we went across the river from the Pentagon to the White House. And we sat in these meetings where they would discuss various issues. And there were things like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So there would be no nuclear weapons testing and various other treaties that, of course, they always went against the grain of what military people think. And Shali would always say, there's a way through this. We can preserve our security, but we can also find a way to make this movement work. He always found a way to compromise without giving away principles, but to move issues forward. And he did it without being personally offensive. And I think if you can work with people and they like you, and you can hold on to your own principles, but advance toward the goals that you think are important, you'll be hugely successful in life. And I believe that at Texas A&M, which is such a great institution, you're getting the educational foundation and the experiences in life to do that. So I encourage you, just in the spirit of the man who asked the question, maybe it was the first question I got, which was, what about your ethics and your values? Ultimately, it's the most important fundamental thing in your life. Know who you are, know where you came from, know what you stand for, and try to live a life that 50 years from now, when you look back on it, you'll be proud of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, really, really good words of wisdom for everyone. I think, and again, you know, you obviously know a little bit about A&M. I think, man, I think what you stand for, I think really embodies the Aggie core values and what we're all about here at Texas A&M University and Mays Business School, and really appreciate your time. And, you know, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
You have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Gig 'em.